And we should be arguing over things, by the way. You've heard a lot of people say, was this like chaotic when we ultimately got into this? This isn't chaos. This is democracy. And we've gotten accustomed to seeing the Omnibus spending bills so much that people don't even know what democracy looks like anymore.
Howdy, everyone, and welcome back to Moment of Truth. This is Season 3, Episode 1. My name is Saurabh Sharma. I'm the president of American Moment, and I'm joined by
Nick Solheim, the COO of American Moment.
Back from being a work-shy lout sitting at home in West Virginia, raising his baby daughter. You're a dad now. How does it feel?
Yeah. Exhausting. And also, like, I don't know, I'll probably get roasted for this, but it's a lot easier than people made it out to be. Yeah. I think
you're not like that loser on Twitter that was like, I hate being a dad. Life sucks so much. I can't smoke weed with my buddies.
Yeah. It's certainly different, but yeah, everybody lies about how hard it is. I mean, she's 2 months old now, and we've gone through, like, from being up with her every 2 hours overnight, learning how to feed her regularly, take care of her. I had literally never changed a diaper until we had. Actually, I don't think I had ever held a baby more than once or twice before we had her. And obviously my wife.
So it's pretty straightforward and simple, is what he's saying. Have some kids.
Yeah, have some kids and have a great wife to take care of. Yeah, that's the way I would put it.
But we're back. Nick had been gone for the past few months, but we're going to make an intentional effort to make sure you get both of us as often as possible. Tweedledum and Tweedledummer. It's going to be
all of your Nick content.
Yeah,
answered.
all of those questions. Where he cuts in halfway through the episode and is like, so like, how does that work? Like, it's gonna be great. Yeah. And today, boy, do we have a fantastic episode to start the season with. I would have loved to have had a great episode for the first episode of the season. We had one of the best episodes we've ever had, period. And it may just be a contender for the best because you're going to learn some stuff in this episode today that you haven't seen in the news. We had on today a returning guest, which is sometimes unexpected because usually people aren't that great to have them on again. But we had on a returning congressman, now technically a chairman. We had on Congressman Dan Bishop, or Chairman Dan Bishop, who, in addition to being one of those 20 congressmen that you heard about on the news who actually made Kevin McCarthy make some concessions to the rest of the conference to make this 118th Congress more than just sitting around twiddling their thumbs for 2 years, he is now a member of this select committee on the weaponization of government, and he is the chairman of the subcommittee on oversight in the Department of Homeland Security Committee under Chairman Mark Green. And so he is going to have a full docket, and we talk about all of that. We talk about the secret story of how these 20 actually came to decide that they would, on that fateful day on January 3rd, vote no, one at a time through that roll call, and what that week's negotiating was like, what they were asking for, what they got, and so much more. We talk about how do we make this church committee real? How do we make it not just another Benghazi 2.0? And we talk about what we're going to do to make immigration law enforced again in this country, what they're going to do with Alejandro Mayorkas, what they're going to do with the TSA, and so much more. It was just fantastic. Congressman Bishop is smooth. He is really good.
It's not just the accent, man. He's like, he knows what he's doing.
He knows what he's doing. He knows what he's saying. And it's like, not BS. It's incredible. It's so much fun to interview him. I can't believe he spent 90 minutes with us in the chair. You guys are going to have a fantastic time listening to this through. And for all the creepy journalists listening, screw you guys. It's just a fantastic episode. We're really, really grateful to the congressman and his staff for helping make it happen to bring him on for the first episode of the season. And we'll go now to Congressman Dan Bishop. Congressman, thank you for coming back on the podcast.
Glad to be with you, Saurabh.
This is the season premiere, and so we thought we had to bring in someone who was really doing something interesting. And, as you joked right before we got started, I asked you, how's the 118th Congress going? And you said uneventful. Clearly, it has not been. You were one of what have been called variously the terrible, the tyrannical, the evil 20 congressmen.
Grandstanders.
They got grandstanders that decided maybe we should actually have a conversation about how the House is governed and what the Republican Congress is going to do. And I think what would be a really exciting opportunity for our listeners is to hear the story of how that happened. Walk us back, however early it makes sense. I actually don't know when these conversations started. When did you start thinking that maybe the first of the year, the third of the year had to be a little bit more complicated than just a coronation?
Yeah. We began in the House Freedom Caucus discussing the way that the procedures we use in Congress, the way we go about doing things should change, that there were many opportunities to do that in rules. And we began working on that last summer. And I know that we had conversations about it probably as early as May or so, because we were trying to figure out how long our process would be to develop rules, ideas that we could suggest and get out there so that freshmen would have an opportunity to consider, freshmen elects in the election would have an opportunity to consider that issue before we elected leadership, which happens the week after Election Day. Now, we ended up developing a list of proposed rules changes by about late July, August. And Michael Cloud from Texas, one of the House Freedom Caucus members, made a proposal to conference that we entertain actually rules decisions before we elected leadership. And like many of the issues that we were talking about, the process for that was to send that off to Siberia, to send that recommendation to a committee, and then the committee didn't really meet till after the election. The only meeting I had with Kevin McCarthy, the leader McCarthy, and with several others during that time, he was really kind of a little miffed that there was a set of proposed rules changes out, and he didn't really want to entertain the substance of them. And we had various people saying that we needed to concentrate on the election, and we didn't need to be measuring the curtains or measuring the drapes in the majority's or in the speaker's office until we had that job done. But we didn't see it that way. But so it was a lengthy conversation, but it was a one-way conversation. No one else wanted to engage in it with us until the election. And following the election, I had a telephone call with Kevin McCarthy a couple of days after. Actually, it was the Saturday after the Tuesday election, and he called to say that when we were having leadership elections the next week, we might spend a little bit of time. There weren't many leadership contested elections, so maybe we devote a little bit of time that was set aside for that to just discuss a few rules changes. And I said, Kevin, the circumstance, there's been a cardinal change in circumstances. You surely realize that, because your viewers will know, or listeners, that we people were hoping for a big red wave. Had there been a big red wave, what happened in January wouldn't have occurred. It occurred because there's a small Republican majority, and so a small group of us could at least require that people entertain some ideas that they're content not to think about. They just are. Most folks seem to be satisfied with the status quo, and I don't see how that can be. That I haven't been here that long in Congress, but everybody, the Congress is an institution, has an abysmally low approval rating. You can look at our nation's debt. You can look at the circumstances in our society, or the in inflation, whatever you want to pick, and you can see that Congress has not been doing a good job. And if an institution's failing, you don't keep doing the same thing in the same way and expect a different result. So that Saturday after the election, I began with Kevin a conversation, and many others began at roughly the same time, and it resulted in really just almost innumerable meetings, conversations, meetings of the entire conference, meetings of select groups cutting across the ideological spectrum within the Republican conference. but not enough progress, not fast enough. We did get through a lot of procedural changes, rules changes, but what was most concerning to me as we got near January 3, the convening of the 118th Congress, was that there was no legislative policy strategy. There had been the commitment to America that Leader McCarthy, developed for purposes of campaigning, but it was vague, kind of poll-tested language. Matt Gaetz called it the palm card for America, famously. And I think that's right. I mean, it had aspirational ideas, but it didn't talk about which battles are we going to go to the mat for in this Congress. Not just to say, well, we're going to pass a lot of messaging bills. I hope you'll be content with us and elect us again. No, when there's divided government, I think it's often a question of will. Who's going to prevail on key issues? And I wanted to see, that's what I most feared having from Kevin. And I didn't see him coming forward with that kind of message. And I believed we were going to drift into this Congress. Mm-hmm. And that would be a critical loss for the American people and the Republican Party.
So tell me a little bit about I guess it would have been the month of November into December. There was a series of 4 or 5 congressmen and women that decided to come out and explicitly say they will not vote for Kevin McCarthy. You weren't among them.
That's correct.
What was the strategy? Was that all coordinated? Were people sort of doing their own thing? What was sort of the strategy and mindset behind that? Because the interesting thing was that with 5 no's, it was supposed to be a foregone conclusion. If there's 5 people saying no, Kevin McCarthy cannot be Speaker. Yeah. Tell me that story.
First thing to say is enormous kudos to those 5. It's a very brave thing to do. They were pounded on from the beginning. I was spared that because I didn't take that step. Their courage made it possible for the group that turned out to be 20 ultimately to get going, to get prepared. We actually had disagreements over that point, though, in the inception. There were those, and one in particular I can think of off the top of my head. I won't name him because I'm not sure it was the first person out, but who was devoted to that idea. I'm not voting for Kevin McCarthy under any circumstance ever. He's the wrong person to lead the conference. And I respected that point of view, but I also recognized with the numbers that we had in comparison to the entire conference, I wasn't sure that it would just be possible to get there. And frankly, those divisions, so we had those kind of fractures, although we worked around them and managed to stay together in an extraordinary, I'm very proud of the work that we all did together. But at the very tail end, it was those same 5 really, or 6. There was one who made it 6 who was also in that camp but did not say so publicly. But at the very end, that same division ultimately reemerged. And when, as I say, we had disagreements over that from the inception, I believed that it was implausible to be, so if, as you say, if 5 or 6 were enough, those 5 or 6 could still have done it. But there is, pressure's real. I think courage is in short supply and up here, and I'd like to see more of it. And I'm pleased with the courage that was shown by the 20 and certainly by those 5 or 6. But when it comes down to that last night's events and the way you see the dialogue kind of deteriorate to the point of almost kind of an embarrassing set of events for the Congress, for the Republican conference, I believe, you don't want to get to that point, and it's not tenable. Mm-hmm. I think there shouldn't have just been 20. I think there should have been 30 or 50 or 75 or 100. So I think there's a lot of introspection to be done across the conference about what we are willing to do to make change up here. Because as to 200, the answer is not much. Mm-hmm. But so those divisions did exist. But again, my hat's off to the 5 or 6. Notwithstanding that, I didn't think that was exactly the position to be in. Their courage speaks for itself.
So one of the interesting elements of that was that even when there were more no votes than Kevin McCarthy could afford, the message and the narrative in the media, and that was telegraphed from his office and across the Republican Party and mainstream media, was it's still going to be Kevin, that it's going to be fine. They're not actually going to vote no. And so the assumption when I see something like that is that they believe that these people would eventually succumb to pressure between those days and January 3rd. What did that pressure look like? What does the establishment do when you say, I'd like a change?
It's an interesting thing to watch. If you go back again to the pre-January, all that period of time from election day, all these conversations going on, including conference meetings of the entire conference. Some of those were focused basically on rules changes. And like the first one that was had, everything suggested was just roundly destroyed, just completely voted down. And then there was one where a number of things were taken, and it was all kind of, it appeared to be choreographed at times. And I still can't quite explain that, but I will say it was palpable. And so there does, people say the uniparty or Washington, the way Washington runs things, there are some signs to me that it's quite managed. Mm-hmm. And I don't really fully understand why people who are elected independently by 750,000 Americans apiece would ever want to sort of participate in something that's contrived or managed in that way. How much wasn't, I can't say for sure, but lots of times it seemed like it. And it always seemed to be a choreographed to kind of give an overall theme. The worst moment, I think, in the course of the thing was the meeting of the conference that we had on the morning of January 3rd. It was a mob scene. It was, and Leader McCarthy, he's apologized for his conduct there. Others have, I think we all mutually ought to be prepared to own our own worst parts of what happened, but that was a mob. And what we're here, it's always been odd to me too, and I've talked about this probably before, that in the Democratic Party, there's not a mirror. It's not a symmetrical picture between the Democrat and Republican Party in Congress. The Democratic Party does leftist things. They move the ball. Their leadership is intentional about doing that. They do not protect the Henry Cuellars of the Democratic Conference, the handful of moderates. Those moderates are on board for just about 100% of their votes. On the Republican Conference side, that's not how it has worked. In fact, the conservatives, we were out there trying to push to make something like that happen, or make it more like that, were really accomplishing conservative things. But what really happens is they tailor, or they attempt to accommodate, most significantly, those who are the farthest to the left in the Republican Conference, so-called majority makers, people who are in so-called swing seats, and all of the effort and that seems to be long-standing, and we've become accustomed to it. So whenever conservatives in the Republican Conference try to push or say, look, my vote, no one owns my voting card except for me. Mm-hmm. If you need my vote to elect a speaker, then we're going to have to do some things to see to it that conditions of that vote are met. And the vitriol that comes back on that, it's almost unexplainable. Mm-hmm. But I would say that moment, that mob scene of a conference meeting right before we went on the floor, I understand some of it. And emotions were high, and people, including the leader, had hoped that they would be able to get it dealt with. But I don't ever expect, we should never see a Republican conference meeting conducted in that way ever again.
It's amazing. Seems like we have 150 or so swing districts, something like that.
Doesn't it seem like that?
You've mentioned these rule changes and procedural things a couple times, and I think, there are probably a lot of people who don't know exactly what kinds of conversations were taking place about particular rules. Could you walk us through, and maybe not even just what you were thinking, but what some of the other members in the conference were putting forward in terms of rule changes.
There are a lot. And
how unreasonable were you being?
I mean, many of these were so and that isn't a good point. How unreasonable were you being? Many of them were really nothing to them. Here's an example. When Liz Cheney needed to be removed as chairman of the Republican conference, I made that motion, and it was. I mean, you no matter how many members, there were 62 or something that ultimately voted in favor of that, but we had to go through essentially Kevin McCarthy had to voluntarily let that come before conference of his own will. The rules didn't allow for it. It just, as I said, made in reference to Michael Cloud earlier, no number of members can bring anything up and make sure conference considers it or deals with it unless the leadership decides to. Many of us have been in state legislatures. We'd sit in caucus meetings there with our party, and anybody could bring up anything and have it dealt with by the caucus in due course. And so that was one that I had proposed. That first meeting, I said, when they had the conference meeting, the first one was sort of choreographed to be, refuse everything. They kind of just trampled that idea. It later got done. But the idea was if you had 25% of the Republican members that can bring up an issue in conference, it can be dealt with immediately. You don't have to send it off to a committee to be heard from maybe or maybe not later on. Minor example. Better, more significant examples and quicker described. Single subject and germaneness. So we see how Congress operates by this, like that $1.7 trillion omnibus spending bill at the end of the year. That's all Congress ever does, really, is those massive bills with innumerable subjects combined into thousands and thousands of pages dropped out there, and they pass. They're really, the decisions are being made by somebody in a back room. There are 5 or 6 people maybe making the decisions. And a lot of small people sending their requests in, but it gets assembled by a handful of people. It shouldn't work that way. So Morgan Griffith, who is not with us as among the 20, but is a member of House Freedom Caucus, he was instrumental in developing the unprecedented rule for the United States House of Representatives that will have single subjects in bills. And the germaneness rule, if there's to be an amendment or a change to that bill, the amendment must be germane, must relate to that single subject. Every rule can be waived is the problem. So if that should be a defense against bills like these massive omnibuses. But as I say, the reason it was concerning to me to make sure we had commitments to specific policies, substantive policies that were in Kevin McCarthy's, in his head is must accomplish, was because I know that every rule can be waived. There are a lot more in the nature of rules changes of all kinds. Which bills can come up on suspension of the rules? How big can they be without having a vote of the individual members, division of the House? And they kind of it's a sort of a laundry list, so they go on from there. I think the most important ones are the single subject and germaneness rules and the potential that brings if we stick with it to see to it we get our bills whittled down. I guess there's one other that's worth mentioning, and that is a rules change that would make in order. Lots of times everything goes through the Rules Committee. It's like the funnel through which all legislation goes to get to the House, to the floor. And as Tom Cole, who's now chairman of the Rules Committee, was ranking member before Oklahoma, described it in one of the conversations, it's really sort of an anti-rules committee because there's a set of rules, but every bill that goes to the floor goes under a special rule. Mm-hmm. Another thing I never saw as a state legislator, everything went through rules committees, sort of managed the flow of legislation, but you didn't go to the floor and have every bill considered under a change of the rules. So you can't offer any amendments. Everything's a closed rule. One change made there is it will, and there's still some flexibility in it, but the Rules Committee should consider it to be in order, not, if there's an amendment to be offered by a member on an appropriations bill that would reduce spending. All those amendments get to be considered on the floor. And that one reason the special rules exist and the limitations on amendments is to let business get done in this large parliamentary body with some nature of dispatch. But what it has resulted in is it looks more and more like President Xi's Politburo than it does an American deliberative body, because it's just sort of like ceremonial votes. Whatever comes through rules, and then everything else is kind of canceled or made out of order, and you just have essentially ceremonial votes on the floor. I mean, I'm not. They're more than ceremonial, but it's not. It doesn't lend itself to the participation that should be going on, and we should be arguing over things. By the way, you've heard a lot of people say, "Was this like chaotic?" When we ultimately got into this, this isn't chaos. This is democracy, and we've gotten accustomed to seeing the omnibus spending bills so much that people don't even know what democracy looks like anymore.
Yeah. So tell me about that a little bit, because I think that is one of the biggest disconnects between DC culture and what normal people think about when they think of how a legislative body works, is that for whatever reason, members of Congress don't want the negotiation to happen in public. Now, I could be uncharitable for all the reasons why that might be the case, but I'm curious, what's the steelman case for why they want that to be the case? Like, what is there any good reasons why they prefer for these things to happen, behind the scenes?
Well, I mean, I just made reference to likening what happens in the United States Congress to what happens in the Chinese Politburo, and I only mean that by way of sort of trying to make a point. But there is something about that ceremony, or giving the appearance of success, seems to be more important sometimes than actual success. I think it's the same sort of telegraphing messages to the voters. We're with you, and yet holding back or not really getting there when the rubber's on meets the road. So if you think all those 20-something votes to repeal Obamacare, but when the real vote that mattered came along, they couldn't get it done. I think there's an artificiality there, and I got to say, in the first couple of days when we were extending the deliberations over the election of the speaker, the reaction from the public was not positive. I mean, there was condemnation raining down on our office back in the district, and here people were upset about it. They know they voted, the Republicans barely won. They want to see smooth operating, everything go like glass. And I think that it almost supplants the what they also know, which is they've had this experience over and over again where they see cosmetic things being said or done that don't ultimately follow through and become real. If I stay here not one more minute in Congress, I am not going to engage in cosmetic and lying to the people. It's a form of lying to the people.
The Obamacare example is so interesting, right? Because, you could tell a story, I think it carries a lot of water, where it was all those fake smooth votes that gave the appearance of unanimity in the conference that led to a world where there was no muscle memory for what the actual negotiating to get to a place where, was it Dean Heller and John McCain at the time could have actually voted for the repeal.
Right.
And so it's almost like it's like dysfunctional families who don't talk through their issues, and eventually one day just boils over and, someone screams and slams the door behind them and leaves like that. It actually has consequences for your ability to govern how you operate when there isn't really a formal upshot. You weren't going to repeal Obamacare under Obama, but it was important to go through not just the motions, but actual substantive discussions in public, because that would train everyone up to be able to do it for real. That is extraordinarily insightful. That's exactly right. We have, and I would say one thing about that event, the extended speaker deliberation in January, the first week of January, and what led up to it, it actually opened up conversations across conference for me and for those of us in the 20 that have never occurred before. So we spent 4 or 5 hours, a group of us, with members of the Tuesday group, which is one of the moderate factions within the Republican conference. We had ultimately there at the end, we were
negotiating detailed agreement provisions with representatives of McCarthy, and those conversations are deeper and more extensive. And I got to know people better than I had before, who are not. And I will say, I mean, as a member of the Freedom Caucus, I spend probably more meeting time with members of the Freedom Caucus than I do with other members across the conference. And some may just not want to, but there are people who are, and there's some connections that I formed. I think of one in my mind right now, John Curtis of Utah, for in my case, just sort of connected in the conversations we were having over the course of the run up to January 3rd, and certainly the that week of January 3rd.
So going back to the timeline on this, I believe because Congressman Biggs had said before the vote that he was going to vote no, correct? So were you the first person alphabetically who was not a publicly committed no to be in the roll call?
Yes, I suppose that's true. Although we did release a statement by Twitter either that morning or the evening before to say that I would not be voting for, that McCarthy's not the right person to lead the conference.
Yeah.
So, but as it came to pass, it was I had thought about that a good bit because I had always heard, the name of the roll will be called, and so whoever's early. These things have been attempted before, and ours lasted a lot more than previous attempts, and it does make a difference, I think, who goes first. I will tell you that in the moment, it didn't bother me a bit. It's just not my. I mean, once I've decided to do something, I don't really spend much time with fretting or wringing hands over it. I just decide. I mean, I don't want to sound like I'm too dogmatic about it, because with my staff and close folks, I worked it over a lot over the month or two leading up to that time. But once I'd gotten there and I knew pretty much where we were going to be, I'm not intimidated at that point.
But I mean, you can imagine a world where, suppose either Congressman Biggs or yourself or both had decided for whatever reason to vote for McCarthy. The entire thing could have collapsed. It could have broken the resolve of the entire 20. I mean, did you guys know before that first vote, a few minutes before that first vote, how many no votes you would actually end up with?
We did. And I will say this also, that was a lot of people sort of think now there were 20. Well, I didn't know there was going to be 20. I mean, I had reason to believe, and there were some. I will say that as we were working very intently to see if we could get everything resolved before we got to January 3rd, that last several days, I think Scott Perry, who's chairman of the Freedom Caucus, member from Pennsylvania, fantastic guy, and he kept the Army together as this, or platoon, whatever we were. But I think he had a better handle on it, and I sort of tried. I didn't want to know exactly who was where within a certain range, and so I didn't realize until about an evening or two before that we had. I thought it was going to be about 17, and I don't think we went on the floor with 20. I mean, we had 18, something like that, and then we picked up a couple. But and in fact, I think one of the ones that came out of nowhere for me was freshman Keith Self from Texas.
Oh yeah. That's my parents' district.
People need to get to know Keith Self. Yeah. He is fantastic. And he had not been involved in all of these conversations, at least in an organized group. And then, of course, I think that made Byron Donald's number 20. And Byron had been talking with us, as some others had who ultimately did not go with us throughout. But, Byron's a tremendous figure. And I think he's a young man, fantastic, bright, prospects. Now, Kevin McCarthy's appointment to the steering committee, the Republican Conference Steering Committee, and I think that speaks well of Kevin and speaks well of Byron.
So one of the fun parts for people who aren't in the House over the last over that week was that because there was no speaker, the C-SPAN cameras were actually able to sort of pan over, and we were able to see all these funny interactions, and there were many memes that came out of it. But I'm sure we only have a small slice of what it was actually like. So that first vote happens, and it's clear that no, there are 20 members that will not vote for Kevin McCarthy, and this will be sort of unprecedented in recent history. What was that like? That environment on the floor?
and there are different. It had ebbed and flowed over the period of time, and some of it, I will tell you, my mind and my memories are dominated by what happened Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, as we began moving in the direction of a possible agreement. And but I would say that first day there were some conversations going on in the back. I talked a lot with Patrick McHenry, who was an intermediary sort of on behalf of Kevin. There were various, no one. One of the things media would always say is, "What's the end game? What's going to end?" And to the same point, we were sort of discussing earlier about people need to be more comfortable with the disagreements and the contention that is necessary to really have genuine democracy and do things that are not artificial. By the same token, not knowing how a democratic process is going to conclude is not a bad thing.
It's almost definitional.
It
wouldn't be a democratic process if you know it's how it's going to end.
It is definitional. So if you believe in it, you got to be comfortable with the level of that. But the media, of course, said there's chaos and dysfunction.
They'd have to rewrite their articles about how Kevin McCarthy became speaker.
Imagine if that's how all that work involved. But
they had filed 2 months ago. They were ready to go.
For sure. But if they, why not just develop some, what's dysfunction is the omnibus, the $1.7 trillion omnibus that gets decided by a handful of people and rammed through.
I think I read about that on Twitter. I think you had a thread about it.
Probably. Yeah, that's right. We did have a thread on that. And actually, a lot of...
in case the listeners didn't see
it. The kudos go to a fantastic staff, which I've just really fine young people.
Yeah, this was one of the most, I think, viewed things about a piece of legislation ever. Like Elon Musk commented on it like 4 times. It was quite an impressive
thing. It was viral because it was substantive. It was interesting. They found the abuses that was funny, and it was just right. That hit. Frankly, I don't think there are coincidences. That hit and went kind of viral and sort of doubled our Twitter followers and so forth. About a week before, or 2 weeks. 2 weeks before, 2 or 3 weeks before we had this occur on the floor. So, but that first day, there were rumors circulating about who might be interested in being speaker, or how long it might take for before McCarthy might give up the ghost, or people might go to him and tell him this. So there was a lot of speculation. I'm not sure as much light as heat in the first on Tuesday the 3rd. Wednesday was an interesting day. That was the day that we adjourned, or we agreed to support a motion to adjourn about 3:00, and until 8 p.m. there were a number of conversations that occurred then. I actually was out of them. It's sort of funny. They always tell you have to communicate, and so that the media had descended, and I did a lot of media interviews, and I wrapped some up about 5:30. I knew there were some negotiations going on, and I did not go insert myself into them. We then had a meeting at ultimately about 7:25 before returning to the floor at 8, and that was a little bit of a misstep in our process, because sort of some incomplete negotiated terms were sort of dumped on the group. We had some very dramatic splits about what we should do as to the 8 o'clock return to the floor, whether we should adjourn. It was about that same time that Club for Growth came out publicly and announced that they had reached an agreement with Congressional Leadership Fund over how, that the leadership would not play in primaries, open primaries.
Was that something really important to you?
Yeah, yes. I think it's a very important issue. I had not spent personally much time over it, but the announcement of an agreement was a stunning surprise to those of us who were contending. We had not been kept abreast. We did not know that was going to happen.
Well, at a convenient time, right? Right before you go back to vote.
And right at the same time, we were sort of had some very difficult challenge for the 20 of us about what exactly to do right then tactically concerning the possibility of continuing to negotiate an agreement or continuing to have votes. And that was a very challenging evening. I went home that evening, Wednesday, with not sure how we were going to proceed. Thursday turned around, though. We continued negotiations. The negotiating process got very specific and some more details. And it went the right direction, and I was then heartened. So there was this kind of uneven process, some moments of despair, some moments where you go, I think this thing could end up in a pretty good place.
Yeah.
Ultimately, it became clear by Friday, certainly Friday fairly early, that we had the makings of an agreement that would satisfy really, I mean, there's still a question about who your top choice is for speaker, but we completed issues on rules. Most of that had already been agreed to. The speaker had conceded that they would restore the motion to vacate the chairs that had existed all the way until Nancy Pelosi changed it. So that's rules, Mm-hmm. There we had developed a very significant set of legislative policy strategy agreements, fiscal restraint, limiting fiscal 2024 spending to the discretionary spending to the 2022 levels, which, that's going to be interesting and tough. But that was the commitment made, that we would not support a debt limit increase until there's bicameral agreement on that spending objective. Mm-hmm. There were some other details about spending a debt prioritization plan, conservative representation on key committees, appropriations and rules and things like that. And ultimately, we had also worked through the question of the select subcommittee on the weaponization of federal government. I personally was deeply involved in the negotiation to make sure that committee that Jim Jordan will run, subcommittee, it's going to be under Judiciary, which he's the chairman of, and he'll be running it as the subcommittee chairman as well. But it was critical to me to ensure that committee had all of the authority that it needed to dig deeply into the deep state. Mm-hmm. And so those were the pieces. And then the last part that comes to mind in the agreement was there was an agreement to put several specific bills on the floor for a vote. Mm-hmm. There's the term limits bill, the fair tax, the Texas border plan, and I believe there's one more. But those were, that was the key of it. And it became clear that was going to come together. And as it did Friday evening, 14 or 15 of us changed our vote. And then ultimately we had that last end game play out.
How does the 118th look different? And obviously this is something you can't, claim credit for, but looking back at what, the agenda or what the committees would have looked like or whatever, if Republicans had had a much larger majority, what's kind of the difference in outcome versus what we got?
For me, I think about what folks may think of this back home. By the way, and before I answer that question, let me just say my impression is that as much condemnation as I got the first couple of days of that exercise, once it became clear the agreement that we had reached and that the scope and fullness of that, the amount of support that I've received personally has just been unbelievable. I was at a community barbecue and serving in the line and people coming through, and just I was surprised that many people knew who I was, much less were following this event and had an opinion about it. So I think that's come out to be a good thing. Now I've lost track of it, but I wanted to say that first, Nick. What was your question again?
How the 118th looks different, with a smaller majority versus what it would have been
if you had a bigger. And that's what I was going to say. So having gotten to the point we've come to, it is interesting to be able to say with great certitude, as I do, not one change would have occurred except for that small group, the small margin, 5, and the 20 people who are prepared to stand up. Mm-hmm. Not one rule change, not being able to discuss things and bring issues up before the conference, not single subject, not germaneness, not putting amendments on the floor that will reduce, spending bills going forward, not a commitment to go to the mat on particular spending restraint objectives, not a broader participation in committees across Congress. And I think it's really an oxymoron or counterintuitive. Most Republican voters would think the bigger the Republican majority, the better. And I suppose it's a question of whether they believe the things that we've described is something that all Republicans would consider salutary or better. I think they would. one thing that's so interesting is there's been a whole bunch of people in the conference saying how great the rules changes are that have been made, and how good it is that we've done these things because they're right in the heart of what Republican platform or policy is about. And yet not one piece of it would have occurred. Because if you had the bigger, swath of seats, plenty of people to get the speaker elected, he could make, do the things he had to do for whatever number that might ask for something in exchange. But most people would be content to just sort of coast on through and trust the fact that the system works. But, Mr. McCarthy's been in leadership here for 14 years. I watched a video that I came across when he spoke to Tea Party Republicans in Bakersfield, California in 2011. And he said then that the three biggest challenges facing America are debt, China, and education. He says that same thing now. And over that ensuing 11, what was it? How many years since then? That's 2011, this is 2023, so 12 years since then. He had been in leadership just a little while then. Each one of those things has gotten worse, not better. And so you have to, it's really not a question of Kevin McCarthy, but whatever's happening here has not turned the ship in the right direction. It's still sailing in the wrong direction. So I subscribe to the idea that means something should change. And
how radical.
I know, exactly. I'm sure they're going to probably run me out of town.
Yeah.
I will say, I do think the rest of this Congress, how it plays out, it also is salutary for that we had this at the front end. I don't think, rather than have speculation every week or two about when people are going to get, now we may still see problems, I don't know. But I think by virtue of having a substantial amount of agreement about what we're going to pursue, and how we're going to go about it, and the committees are emerging, and they are indeed. We're satisfied that members of House Freedom Caucus and other conservatives are being represented on committees. I think that will result in the management of the 118th Congress and the Republican conference in a way that is better and keeps us together. And so I think it worked out pretty well.
There's an element to this fight that I can't stop thinking about, which is this was a rebellion of freshmen, sophomores, and juniors. I mean, it was, I think I did the math on this, it was something like 16 or 17 out of the 20 have been here for 3 terms or fewer. I mean, technically, like if you, two terms or fewer, I mean, if you don't even count the start of the new Congress as a term, like people who like yourself who had been there for 1 full term, 2 full terms. Think about someone like Chip Roy, who had been there since 2018. Someone like yourself who's been here since about 2020. Someone like, Matt Rosendale, who's relatively new, et cetera, et cetera. Young members. And then the fact that on top of these young members, you had 5 newly elected freshmen, 2 of which I don't think anyone expected. Like Eli Crane and Keith Self, everyone expected would be good members, but like no one expected that they would step out in this way. And then Anna Paulina Luna, Andy Ogles, and
Josh Burkeen.
Josh Burkeen. That feels like a sea change. I mean, you experienced this a little bit because in your very first term, you decided to go after the third rail of American politics, which is questioning our foreign policy establishment. So you were out there already. Like, has the script on what it means to be a new member of Congress or a young member of Congress changed completely?
That's a great question, Saurabh, and it goes deeper than I had spent much time thinking about. As I said, I believe special credit is due to the 5 who started. That's and they're all in the category you described. But that 6th one who is not public but was not McCarthy, and the other freshman, he was a freshman, and the other freshman, the ones you named, I'm so proud of them. They're extraordinary. It's a great question. I think you've seen these Republican Study Committee emerged, a couple decades ago, and then it was kind of co-opted. House Freedom Caucus developed in 2015, I guess. I think that's right. And it has had, right now I'd say we've got a challenge ahead for us because we've got roughly half of us didn't participate in this. But that group of 20, and it was really, it is, you cannot deny that some things that we accomplished, or the things that we did, whether you call them accomplishments or not, were historic. That amount of time, that number of ballots to elect a speaker has not occurred since before the Civil War, 1856, when now we had like 137 ballots, so it's not even close. But the 1923.
So 2,238, they're going to be saying, since 2022, since 2023, we've never had this many ballots.
That's right.
Yeah.
And but the 2023 last rebellion, if it were, or last issue, was the progressive Republicans, Bob LaFollette and others out of Wisconsin and all, and they held for about 5 ballots or something like that in order to get some rules changes. I also think the change to the Rules Committee, the change to the complexion of the Rules Committee, is something that it marks a new era in Congress's, and we've had these things change from time to time over the course of history, but that's an historic change. The germaneness and a single subject approach, and see if it does, that's novel. These things are new. It is a real departure in many ways, and I have great hope for it. Whether it portends something that is changing in the election of members, I don't know. I do think for that purpose, the fact that there is this supposed agreement that CLF will not play in open primaries, using the power of leadership and the draw for funds that represents in order to beat conservatives and try to elect members who are not conservative, which perpetuates exactly the kind of status quo that I've decried. But yeah, I'm hopeful that what you've seen is maybe a turn that the Tea Party certainly that movement tried to bring members who would actually say enough, where it's time to change, but it didn't really make things change enough in Washington. It got Republicans elected, but you saw Boehner and then Ryan. It didn't get us where we needed to be. Maybe now we're seeing enough members elected that people, we know that it's too late to do anything other than change. If we don't change, the country's not going to make it.
So one of the changes that you fought most intensely for throughout this process, I think it's fair to say that if you hadn't put our flag in the ground, it wouldn't have happened, was this select committee on the weaponization of government. It's interesting because it plays into something that we've admired you on for quite some time now, which is your more circumspect approach on foreign policy and the American security state. Tell me, why did you think this committee had to exist? What events in the news, experiences you've had told you that we needed this in the new Congress?
As a member of the public, I watched as it developed the Russiagate controversy from the January 2017 Intel Community assessment that gave credence to the Steele dossier through the briefing of the president, the BuzzFeed release, all the machinations that led thereafter to Jeff Sessions being recused on ridiculous grounds, in my view, the appointment of a special counsel, Robert Mueller, the 17 angry Democrats, everything that's happened, and some of which you didn't know at the time. Igor Danchenko, the primary subsource. While they knew he was a liar, they made him an FBI informant in March of 2017 and kept in that status till October of 2020. The Alpha Bank, so all of it. It was a massive, just like President Trump said, it was a massive hoax. Watching our institutions do that, the Department of Justice and its FBI, were, I think, sort of an indelible mark for me. I observed it casually. I eventually came to learn a fair amount of detail about it and all the aftermath. But that was the first thing that sort of got me fundamentally changing my view about federal law enforcement. And then serving on the Judiciary Committee, I've had a chance to see that's sort of a specific, even as many as things as I just articulated, they're all about that Russia hoax. Mm-hmm. But then you see the stuff just exploding everywhere. You see an obvious double standard, politicized justice. People who riot, if they're Antifa, they get released from jail. If they join the riots on January 6th, thousands are prosecuted, and people who are just in the wrong place and did virtually nothing have their lives destroyed. It goes on. But I mean, when you get into the question, when you start seeing things, while I'm sitting in judiciary of the Attorney General writing the memo to target parents because they didn't like how parents were mouthing off to school boards, and then the Twitter files, to make it recent, the Twitter files are released, and you see, and you go dig into the bottom of that, the Foreign Influence Task Force at the FBI. Sounds like something we definitely want to have, a foreign influence task force. But when you go look at the website, Chris Wray, the director of the FBI, created this thing from whole cloth in 2017. And what is it doing? It's going to Twitter and telling them, and just because we know about Twitter because Elon Musk has disclosed it, but there's a whole Facebook and everybody else. We don't yet know what they've done there, but they're actually engaging. They got special agents in charge who are going out and engaging and telling these people, we don't think that should be out in the public discussion. What? About what? When did they imagine that their role as federal law enforcement is to regulate the American discourse? That's insane. And what I think, it's like being the frog in the pot, but they suddenly your attention has been captured. And mine, so when you go back and look at historic analogs, that's what I want to do. Go back and say, wait a minute, this has gone wrong. When have we had seen something like this? And you go back to Frank Church, liberal Democrat senator from Idaho in 1975, after Seymour Hersh had written in the New York Times about foreign covert actions that had no clear authorization, where they were committing assassination plots, and FBI, COINTELPRO, and MK Ultra, and these things, abuses that had gone on before. And you say, that was a moment when they recognized something had gone badly wrong. It was precipitated maybe by the resignation of Richard Nixon and all the things associated with that. But it was a moment when Congress recognized something's got to change. And my view is we're in worse shape now than we were then by some distance. Mm-hmm. I also have just recently discovered that in 1981, there was a Senate Select Committee on FBI undercover operations. So another point, I mean, many of these things are undercover operations or confidential investigation, but the Whitmer kidnapping plot was another. Maybe that's defensible by the FBI, but I don't know. I mean, it's just such an extravagant application of resources to suck in people who may have been malignant people, but they're people just living on the margins of life with no capacities of their own to go engage in something where they might go kidnap the Michigan governor. That whole idea only existed because the FBI plowed resources into making it possible. That is a specific type of use of an undercover operation that they recognized in 1981 was not what should happen. And liberal Republican Senator Charles Mathias of Maryland, who headed that select committee, proposed a bill in the next Congress to codify and modify the law of entrapment, coming exactly out of that sort of thing. So I'm always comforted to go back and look for an analog in the past where the United States Congress has recognized that there's a problem that needs to be tended to. Mm-hmm. And I think you need to get as informed about those prior attempts as possible. What satisfied them? Why did they not go farther than they did? And I think, and I have thought, and I've worked really hard to see to it that there's authority to dig into. There's authority to set right the relationship between the United States Congress and the bureaucracy. The United States Congress makes laws. We're all elected, 750,000 people at a pop, and we come together and make laws. We've been talking about how we make laws in the Congress and trying to fix that and make that work better. Now this is the rest of the governmental problem, which is Chris Wray doesn't think we're relevant. He doesn't think Congress matters. He's sitting atop the FBI. It has a budget of $11.5 billion. just got another $500 million from our friends in the Senate, including 18 Republicans in that omnibus, and he believes that he can do anything he wants to, sort of a potentate. Well, I don't believe that's right. And I don't think he can listen. I don't think he should be collecting bulk data, or at the NSA, they ought to be collecting bulk data on Americans. I don't think their contractors ought to be running unlimited searches without authorization on those databases about Americans. I don't think people ought to be targeted for going to mouth off to their school board. And I don't think the FBI needs to decide what we say in our society, in our public discourse. So Jim Jordan, I have a lot of trust in Jim Jordan. Thomas Massey and I are both on that committee. Some other great members are. I intend to dig harder than I've dug on anything else in my life to see to it that we get to the bottom of some of this stuff and show it to the American people. That doesn't end the story, because you've also got to reform it in a way that actually fixes something instead of makes it worse. Mm-hmm. That tends to be a problem with Congress as well.
So we talked about this last time you were on the show. One of the kind of heuristics that people use sometimes for maybe how not to do this is, like the Benghazi hearings, and then people say, how do we prevent this from being another Benghazi? And I guess I'll remove that example. We'll just say, how do we make this real? The creation of the committee, there were some things in its premise. You made sure it was well funded and everything. It looks like there's the right members on it. If you and Congressman Massey are on it, I'm pretty satisfied there.
They won't get anything by you guys.
We'll ask some hard questions.
But what needs to happen now to make this committee real?
It can't go chase little stories. It's not a question of going to find some individual, some hapless Lois Lerner who will take the Fifth Amendment. That's really not the point. We've got to conceive of it broadly enough and get after things. I personally think we must fully exercise the funding and staffing authority that's been given to the committee. The deal that we made is that it would have all of the funding and staffing of the January 6th Select Committee.
And what? Tell me about that order of magnitude.
I don't know, except I think, in fact, I know that the church committee was funded with the equivalent of about $4.5 million in 1975. So if you inflation adjusted what they did then, it'd be about $4.5 million, and they hired 135 staff. That kind of gives you an idea of scale. I don't think the staff for the J6 committee was as big, but I think it's like on the order of 80 or 90 or something like that. I imagine the money was much, much bigger.
Yeah, look pretty well funded.
The way they burn money. I don't want to burn money on a Hollywood producer to make something for TV. What I want to do, and we're going to have to struggle with the stonewall out of every administrative agency.
Hasn't the DOJ already said as much?
Certainly, absolutely. They've said, according to their precedent, they don't believe that they can provide anything concerning ongoing investigations. I asked about the Gretchen Whitmer kidnapping plot in a Judiciary Committee hearing last year, and was told that's an ongoing investigation. We can't comment. In other words, there are bridges to be crossed here. I've got in my mind for some later time, when there's Republican control of both branches of Congress and the presidency, a means to fix this dance that goes on between Congress and the administration. And I think some people up here think, well, maybe sometime we'll have an administration, and we really don't want to make sure. I think there's too much secrecy in Washington. I think too much stuff is concealed. I think these haughty, all-powerful bureaucratic agencies believe they dictate how American society runs, and they want to keep it just like that. I believe we need to open it up.
Yeah. They draw their prestige from it. I mean, the overclassification is an issue that's talked about all the time. Everyone wants to be the guy who's access to top secret information. It turns out, what soda machine is in the FBI is top secret information. So it's like, sorry, like find a different way of going to bed at night and convincing your wife that you're all great. Like you can't use this system to do that.
Yeah, cloak and dagger. I think that's right. It gives people a sense of their importance, perhaps. But you can see, I mean, frankly, we'll see what happens with all the classification stuff. But, the Mike Pence, that story just came out today. He's found some classified documents home. Biden keeps finding them in the back of his Corvette or whatever. But I think that it probably is an indicator that we'll see. But my guess is that there's not crucial, earth-shattering secrets that are in those documents that they throw in a file box somewhere. I think it's just that there tends to be this, the people who are exercising bureaucratic power love to do so in the dark of night without the glare. They don't want the accountability. And as soon as they're prepared to go put their name on a ballot and get elected, I'd be glad for them to exercise authority. But I don't really want them to be an unaccountable source of power all on their own.
What's on the table in terms of, consequences for these kinds of actions that have been going on the last couple of years? I think, the narrative that I've been seeing so far is it's like, Congressman Bishop is out for revenge, or like this committee is out for revenge. But really, like what proactively is on the table in terms of, you're talking about future administrations, and I think this is definitely the right direction to go. But like, what's on the table in terms of things that you could actually change, both Republicans being out of the executive branch, but also what could be possible in the future? Well,
I think it's a good question. And I will tell you, I believe Republican voters who would support what I'm doing probably are of two very different mindsets on this. There are some who are damn sick and tired of nobody paying a price. The real way to be honest with them, though, is to say Congress is not the mechanism to cause somebody to pay a price. That's an executive function. It's in the FBI. I don't control the FBI and its prosecutorial decisions at this point. It'd be good for a future American president to see to it that we follow through in a way. But others have said, and some have said, some of the people I'm in, and frankly, I invite people to be in touch who've got insights, because I don't have any corner on the insights about what we ought to look at. But some of these guys, I call them the Russiagate corner of the internet. These guys who figured out who Igor Danchenko was and all these things. These guys are brilliant, and I've followed a number of them, and I've corresponded with some of them. And happens to be the case that two who've been most voluble and having things to say have both independently said the same thing, that the first thing you should do is grant immunity to every witness. Now, I don't know if I want to completely go there, but their point is you need to find out what's happening rather than figure out, then sort of it's not really about naming and shaming people as much as it is, it is about naming and shaming these big agencies and what and the power that they've purported to exercise. You want to let the American people see fully what it looks like when the fundamental relationship between people and government that this country was founded on in its Constitution is upended. That's what we're looking at. The government is subservient to the people in the United States of America. And the bureaucrats, particularly the ones that, as you say, are in the cloak and dagger, really interesting intel and law enforcement and the Department of Justice. They have a very different attitude about who's the boss, and they may prevail. I don't know, but the last best chance for this to be rectified is to have people of courage in the Congress who will not accept no for an answer. And gets the information and shows it to the American people. And then we see what the reforms are from that point forward. There are reforms to be had. I think people talk about the January 6th. I think our pretrial detention statute needs to be revisited. It's entirely too broad. It can have a range of abusive outcomes. I think we need to look at the Attorney General's guidelines for undercover operations and see if those need to be codified and need to be controlled in some way. I think the FBI itself may need to be changed. Its counterintelligence function may need to be separated out and sent to another agency. I think it needs to be decentralized, where power is not, decision-making is not concentrated in the headquarters, but it is returned, frankly, to an earlier version of the FBI where the special agent in charge of the decentralized FBI field offices made more decisions. I think less needs to happen in the Washington and Southern District of New York field offices, and things need to be moved elsewhere in the country. So I think I'm full of ideas about what we might ultimately do to reform, but I think that we need to all learn from the revelations that come out in this investigation. And I just think having an ambitious effort to undertake an ambitious effort that means business because we believe in it is the key to avoiding discrediting ourselves in the way that you described as possible. And I do think that's right. If we don't, if we go in with an artificial effort, made for TV show trial, kind of a Benghazi hearing approach I don't think was really believed in. Remember the comment that Kevin McCarthy made about it?
And lost him the speaker once.
Right. And you can think about the comments that Trey Gowdy made as he was leaving Congress. I will never forget. I don't remember them precisely, but I remember them in general. I just have a different view about it. I mean, I came up here for real substantive reasons. Mm-hmm. I intend to accomplish them. I intend to exert the will to see to it that we get there. And I'm just one guy, but they're not getting my voting card and they're not shutting me up. The only way they can do that is by, sending me home or do something worse.
Voters didn't seem very interested in doing that. It's interesting. Committee's going to have limited resources. You all have limited resources. So there obviously has to be some, curating of what you guys are going to focus on. The other, focusing too much on shiny objects is going to be one risk. And then the other risk, I think, potentially is being overbroad and not discovering novel information either.
True.
So walk me through what's the maybe the A minus and B plus tiers, the top areas of focus that you guys are particularly interested in. What questions are you looking to answer with this committee's work over the next 2 years?
So I would say it's too early to say for sure. Mm-hmm. I've had a lot of conversations with Jordan. Mm-hmm. I've done a good bit of work myself. Staff and I are working on sort of developing our own independent roadmap. I will, I'm trying to think what is at the top of that list. That list is very long and it's going to have to be whittled and refined, as you say. My own view is that the thing that looms largest as I sit here, and I've already made reference to it, is the degree to which sort of a metastasizing Department of Justice and FBI have seen fit to intrude upon our public discourse and our election management. I don't think CISA, the cyber security thing in the Department of Homeland Security, and the FBI have license to go regulate our speech and our discussion with each other. Maybe that's a question of recency coming out in the Twitter files, but when you consider the breadth and scope of public discourse through social media and the notion that FBI is actually engaging on a regular basis to decide to take down this comment and that comment that aren't illegal. Mm-hmm. They're First Amendment protected comments. As far as and it's become clear they're not foreign inspired. Mm-hmm. They've used that excuse with the Hunter Biden laptop. There's Russian disinformation. They've just decided they're going to take it down. Think about the COVID, the public health aspect of that, the degree to which they decided that there's wrongthink. This is 1984. This is George Orwell kind of stuff, and it's actually happening by dint of, I mentioned FBI, DOJ, but the entire public health establishment.
The layer to this that I find interesting is if you had given me a choice of which files to get, last year, it's like, where do you suspect the most malfeasance is happening? I don't think I would have. I don't think I would have said Twitter. I think I would have said, like, maybe I want to see what the Google files are. Maybe I want to see what the Facebook files are. Maybe I want to see what the Cloudflare files are. You guys will have an opportunity to see, because you have the access to this side of the ledger now. Not all those companies can be taken over by a patriot like Elon Musk. You'll be able to send, what Google can do to public discourse is more sinister and expansive than what Twitter can.
I think that's absolutely true. Yeah, Twitter's a peon really in the grand picture. Maybe the thing about the Twitter files that Elon Musk has disclosed, there is recency, and it is something that's happened. Mm-hmm. But it is you actually have the specifics and the disclosures and what they represent is, to me, if you're open-minded to it, is shocking. And it helps cement the contemplation of what you would find if you got into Google and Facebook and at the scale that they represent, especially Google, and how widely is our entire social fabric being manipulated, and our thoughts massaged and managed. So your mind immediately runs to, globalist kind of thinking and World Economic Forum and the ability of a handful of people. And it's funny. This is, to the extent they're associated with the left, which constantly preaches about saving our democracy or the threats to our democracy, and that kind of machination, that kind of massive government power, ultimately brings every human being under thumb. I think the things that we shouldn't get bogged down in necessarily, or would be candidates for my second rank in terms of listing things to do, is I don't really know that spending all that much time about the FBI raid on Trump's Mar-a-Lago compound was justified, or whether Biden, disclosed his problem with classified documents before the election in time. Some of those things seem to me inside ball. The thing I'm concerned about is how are the people of the United States finding their choices and their destiny manipulated by the government power of a government that's supposed to serve them?
Yeah, I it's interesting to think about, right? Like, probably less than 5% of Americans use Twitter on a regular basis.
Right.
And if you think that the the misinformation, if you will, that they were spreading, if you think that influenced elections, how much more so for, companies like Google, which has like 90% market share in the United States. I mean, theoretically, like, you could be looking at a drastically different country even from, 4 years ago.
Absolutely true.
Based on that information.
I think that's right. And then actually, so we've contemplated the reach of maybe a lot of the tech companies. What about all media? Mm-hmm. What about the media corporations? There's been a lot of concentration of power in there and mergers and so forth. Remember when the Bush administration was trying to keep the New York Times from publishing the details of the call intercept regime that was going on? Well, I mean, that's the thing, is they've gotten now into far more pedestrian subject. That at least had a national security. I don't think it should have been kept from the American people either, but at least it had a national security angle. We're talking about, what do you believe is the origin of the COVID vaccine, and the entire massive and metastasizing CDC and NIH, the organs of public health. All reach out to say what can be believed at one point, what you're going to be punished, and that filters through all sorts, not just certainly not just Twitter, certainly not just Google and searches on the internet, and but in every news article you read, because of the decisions that are made and are manipulated by the involvement of the betters or the special cognoscenti from Washington. It's crazy. I wouldn't say I'm Pollyanna about fixing these things. Yeah. But I do think if you might as well start talking about the scope of the real problem. Yeah. And then when you're doing that, maybe somebody will dismiss you as a crackpot or conspiracy theorist. I'm sure that's what the FBI said about Twitter, right? Yeah. They said that we were just engaged with our community partners, and we regret that that is bred conspiracy theories. That's when look, if they're so far gone that they don't recognize, or that they believe that statement should pass muster, that depicts what we are up against. Yeah, Russia. They didn't even have the self-awareness to recognize, man, we've overstepped or something, or try to tamp it down. They were just contemptuous of the idea that all that has been disclosed.
Yeah, it's just been like Russian disinformation is defined as anything that I don't like.
100%.
Yeah. The final element of I think what's going to occupy a lot of your time this Congressman is you've been selected to be the chair of the subcommittee on oversight at the Homeland Security Committee under Chairman Mark Green. Tell us a little bit about what matters to you there. Obviously, we've got a giant crisis at the border, and that's Alejandro Mayorkas is doing. I think there's a bunch of things that you're very interested in focusing on there. Walk us through what's motivating you to be involved in that fight in particular.
Well, there are, and
another element of the security state, Department of Homeland Security.
I think that's very, very much so. And in fact, the Disinformation Governance Board was the concept of I started to say a bad word, not a curse word, but just an insult to the people that are over there. But people decided to do that. It was an unbelievable bad decision. Look, first and foremost, I think Chairman Green will be concerned about, and I'll be helping him with oversight relating to the management of the United States border. And so last month, 253,000, I believe is the number, of encounters of illegals crossing the border. That number has grown and grown and grown. That was the largest number in a month in history. And the impacts on the fabric of American society of uncontrolled entries, which is what we effectively have, in those kind of quantities I don't know why anybody would bother to deny that that's going to be destructive to American society in short order. So I think that the focus is on Secretary Alejandro Mayorkas. He has been, you talk about how contemptuous and brazen the FBI was in the statement I just made reference to. Well, every appearance I've ever seen of Mayorkas in front of Congress has been that and worse. So I think there's a reckoning coming for Mayorkas. I think the question of whether he should continue to serve is certainly on the table, and I anticipate that Oversight Subcommittee will be looking deeply into that.
Is that a shiny object, impeaching Mayorkas? Do you worry it might become one?
Yeah, I think it's conceivable. I mean, it's at least something to be concerned about. I do think that there are indications of it that it's highly warranted. Mm-hmm. I think there is to the border situation it has its own significance, that and the administration, like it does have more discretion and to figure out how to proceed in terms of operating the border than I think is appropriately conferred, that really exists at the FBI in terms of enforcing criminal law and the like. And so there's a special responsibility there. Mm-hmm. And I think that, so, many have said that some people want to impeach the president and that you can do impeachments forever. I don't think you ought to get out of control, but I think there have to be real answers about how the border's been managed, because they've surrendered the United States border. Mm-hmm. And I think maybe some people believe that if you did that for a while, it would slacken. It is not slackening. Yeah. And so the longer it goes, the bigger question that portends. So I think it may have some elements of a shiny object, but I think that's certainly going to be a focus. And I think you've got to do something to restore the enforcement of American immigration law. I think beyond that, I know we've got some serious issues, frankly, at TSA and its success. I'm concerned about CISA, the role that CISA played in the election past, and I think it's also a situation where there's sort of an assuming authority that's not necessarily been conferred. I'm sure there are a number of things that Mark Green will want to get at, and we've sort of got time to get together, put our heads together on that. But those are the kind of the highlights from my perspective.
Tell me about TSA a little bit. You had a post a few days ago talking about this leak of 1.5 million people on the no-fly list.
Right.
I mean, it seems like this perfect combination of so many different issues. I mean, incompetence, malice, secret tribunals that decide the fate of all Americans. It seems like right up your alley. What'd you make of that story?
Well, I think it is, and I think to the caution you've offered, I'm not sure that anything's a shiny object. So we'll see how to proceed as we learn more about it. I think we've got to ask about it. 1.5 million names on it. I'm curious how many are U.S. persons. I'm curious why that was on a server that somebody could find. They didn't have to hack, as I understand it. I mean, it was an unprotected server. I think it was a
noflylist.txt.
Yeah. But if that's the case, it also begs the question: if this is, and I don't know what the airline was, I don't remember recognizing the name, so I assume it's a smaller airline. Why is that list just dumped on airlines? I mean, one would think it would be more like the NICS system in gun purchases, where there's some database that's on a federal computer that someone can authenticate to and inquire and search, perhaps. But I'm surprised that 1.5 million names are dropped on every airline. So indeed, it does. Once more detail, if more detail emerges, or we can discover more detail about who's on the no-fly list. I've asked some questions before in confidential briefings about the no-fly list and really haven't been able to get much information. I do think that it's funny. We do live in interesting times, and you get some new revelation every day. I don't know that any of us expected the no-fly list would drop out of the cyberspace into our laps, but it does beg the question why DHS has allowed that to occur.
So there's going to be plenty for you to do in the new Congress, and so we should probably let you go at some point. But before we do, is there anything else that you think people should be paying close attention to this Congress? It's so easy for people to get complacent once they think they've got power, and I think your message is generally never be complacent. What should people be vigilant about and paying attention to for these next 2 years?
I do think the experience we've had with the way in which we approach the inception of this Congress, the questions that were asked about the election of the Speaker, the result that we've obtained, which for the reasons I've argued, make us likely to be a better and more functional Republican majority. I think we ought to retain some of the lessons of that, which is, and among Republican voters, I want them to hold us accountable. I want them to I'm amazed how much they keep up, and they do. And so I'm pleased by that. But I think they ought to, I think that they know we're in divided government. They know we're not going to be able to get everything that we want, but, somebody wins every negotiation. And my experience or my observation has been that Republicans are habituated to being obliterated in negotiations across the party divide, and there's not really a good reason for that. Why would Joe Biden says he's not going to negotiate over the debt ceiling? Really? I think he is going to negotiate over the debt ceiling, but I think what seems most rare, and I said this at the American Conservative, we were there together that evening, that it really, sometimes a little bit of courage works out marvelously well. I don't think that means being reckless or foolhardy. But my goodness, if you look around today at the state of the United States and the world, isn't it time for a little bit of courage? Again, as I said before, and when I appeared with you guys before, it's not a question of the soldiers who may die and as they display courage to save the country, but just people who are politicians who have nothing to do other than run another election down the road, and they may lose that. But maybe a little bit of courage would leave the nation in a better place. I hope so, and I encourage it on the part of my fellow members of the Republican Conference, and to Republican voters, I say you ought to expect it and you ought to demand it.
Well, Congressman, we thank you for doing everything you did over these past few months, and really in your entire time in politics. People should go and listen to the previous episode to hear how you've been, fighting corporate and state and cultural power for, the last decade, it seems like. Thank you for spending some time talking to us about all of this for the season premiere here, and thank you for everything you do.
Great to be with you, Saurabh. Nick, great to be with you guys.
Hopefully you guys enjoyed that. We certainly had the best time imaginable taping it. Be sure to follow everything Congressman Bishop is doing. If you follow him on social media, unfortunately, you're going to be one of many. His Twitter following is like multiplied by 7 over the course of the last just few months alone. He had this massive thread about the Omnibus package, and then everything he was doing as part of the 20. So he's really making moves out there. Be sure to share the clips that come out of this podcast. Follow us on Twitter at ammoment.org. Be sure to check out the backlog of this podcast at americanmoment.org. Also, keep an eye out. There are a bunch of new programs live or will be live very shortly here. Our Fellowship for American Statecraft, Foundations of American Statecraft, a credentialing program on foreign policy, so much more. Keep an eye on the website. There's plenty there. Sign up for the mailing list. And in general, keep up with everything that we're doing. We're getting close to our 2 years of existing. This is episode 91 of the podcast. Be sure to rate and review it on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, subscribe on YouTube. Look at our happy mugs. We tape with these freaking 4K cameras and actually make an effort to get our bums in the chair to tape every episode of this.
I don't say we always look nice. But
speak for yourself. I have a nice haircut. I'm wearing a coat and tie. I actually try, unlike you.
Yeah.
He's got a beard and everything too. That's why you got to watch on YouTube. You could make fun of him for trying to look like a Viking. It's going to be a fun year here at American Moment. We are raring to go. We've been incredibly busy already, and we're just incredibly grateful to all of you for listening, as always, and making this a podcast that people want to be on and want to listen to. We'll see you guys next week. Moment of Truth is an American Moment Studios production filmed at the Conservative Partnership Center. Our podcast is produced and edited by Jake Mercier and Jared Cummings. Our intro music is A Minor Struggle by Ryan Serenich. Don't forget to like and subscribe on all platforms, and you can go to AmericanMoment.org to learn more.